In previous videos, we've talked about what is Socratic seminar and why to use it. We've talked about what Socratic seminar tends to look like. And we've talked about how to pick readings and how to go about choosing good readings that work for seminars. So if you haven't seen those videos, I would recommend those first. In this video, we're going to talk specifically about creating good discussion questions, because our role as teachers and professors is to kind of facilitate the discussion and also participate in it. But oftentimes we are the ones that generate a lot of the questions that will be discussed. And the seminar really depends on the quality of the questions. So I want to review with you 4 broad categories of questions that I find kind of helpful to think about. And these are 4 slightly different kinds of questions. The lists aren't exhaustive and the categories are pretty large, but I think that thinking about questions in these 4 ways will help us. So I divide the types of questions into 2 types. The types of questions you bring to a seminar that you kind of prepare in advance, and the kind of questions that happen during seminar. So when you're preparing for a seminar, the 2 kinds of questions that I like to think about are what I call analysis questions and perspectival questions. And then the kind of questions you might ask as a facilitator during a seminar that you didn't really prepare in advance are what I call clarifying questions and elaboration questions. Let's start with the kinds of questions that you prepare before the seminar. So obviously our job is to really be familiar with the reading and come up with kind of a list of questions that we might ask during the seminar depending on how the discussion is going and where it's going. The first type I call analysis questions. These are the kinds of questions where students are really focused on what the text means and how to interpret the text. So rather than jumping in with what do we think about the text or what do we think about the author's argument here or what do we think about what this character did, these are questions that really focus on what is our understanding of what the text means? What is our understanding of what this character did? So I find these questions good to bring up first. Oftentimes you want to flesh out the groundwork and refamiliarize everyone and reorient everyone with the text and what it means before you actually get into agreements and disagreements. Otherwise, what I find to happen is people might disagree about a particular point in the text simply because they have different understandings of the text. And we would have known that if we would have looked at the analysis questions first. The second kind of question flows from that, and it's what I call a perspectival question. And this is a pretty broad category. This is really where you bring the participants into the reading. And instead of talking about what we think the reading means, we're now talking about our response to the reading. Do we agree with what the author means by this particular point? Do we agree with what the character did? Can we relate to what the character did? These are the kinds of questions that I think involve bringing in the reader's perspective. And again, it could be, do we agree with, do we disagree with? It could be, what is your perspective on what the character did? Do you think that it was justified? Do you think that it wasn't? It could be experiential questions where you ask them to bring in experience. And those are the kinds of questions, by and large, that we usually bring with us to seminar that we have prepared, although you could also think of some of those questions as the discussion comes up. But these next 2 types of questions are questions that usually you won't have prepared in advance, and usually you as a facilitator bring up because you're responding to someone else's question or point or something like that. Because our job through the discussion is to sort of push the discussion forward when necessary, only when you think it's necessary to interject. So the first kind of question that you would kind of generate during a discussion is what I call a clarifying question. A clarifying question is when you think that the discussion would benefit from someone clarifying either their point or their question. So sometimes it happens in my seminars where folks will bring up a really interesting point and they won't really clarify the question or point. But I can tell that there's really something there that maybe they just need to think out a little bit further, or maybe the group can help them think out a little bit further. So I'll just interject with, I'm not sure I understand your question or your point when you say this. Can you clarify what you mean by that? And oftentimes just a really quick question like that to ask for clarification really boosts the discussion. So another kind of clarification that I have found is often necessary is when different people in a group disagree about something regarding the text. Maybe they disagree with whether a point is persuasive, or maybe they disagree about what a character did, or something like that. I often find that it seems to me during the discussion that it's because the 2 people have different understandings of what the author means. So another kind of clarification that I sometimes ask is that Well, it seems like when the two of you are disagreeing about X, it may be because we have different understandings about X. So can you and you clarify what your understanding of X is? And then that can launch us into a really good discussion, in a way almost back to an analysis question, because now we go back to focusing on what the author means by. The last type of question that I think is really helpful to generate during Socratic seminar discussions is what I call expansion questions. And this is really, instead of asking someone to clarify their point or to clarify a meaning, it's really trying to push them further in the discussion. So sometimes a discussion will kind of start to peter out or lose momentum or recycle. And in those cases, you might want to think about, is there anything that was said that I think people would benefit from expanding upon and maybe pushing a little bit further. So an example that happened to me actually recently in a Socratic seminar is someone brought up an author's passage. And the passage was fairly ambiguous. And the question was a really great question. They asked, so when the author says X, do you think they mean this, or do you think they mean this other interpretation? That's a really great analysis question that a student brought in. And we talked about it for a little bit of time. And the question that I had afterwards was, do you think it would matter to the author's case if they meant this or if they meant the other thing? In other words, if they meant this versus the other thing, how would their argument have to change? Or would their argument still make sense? Or it could be that if you're talking about a novel or a short story, it could be the kind of thing where someone says, well, I really disagree with what the character did here. I think they should have done this other thing. And maybe an expansion question would be, well, let's think really hard about why the character did that. Like, pretend you're the character. Give a really good defense of why you did that. And in some ways that asks for an expansion, because now students are really thinking very hard about that particular thing. So just to show you what some of my questions look like when I go into a Socratic seminar, here is an excerpt from a sheet that I keep where I profile each chapter of a reading that I assign for a course, and I list some discussion questions that I might bring in. So the highlighted part isn't terribly important to us, but this is where I keep track of what goals and objectives for the course the chapter aligns with. It's kind of useful if you have goals and objectives for a course that you have to kind of cover, because this lets you know where you need to steer the discussion. So the second paragraph is simply a summary of the chapter that I can read before class that refreshes my memory of what the chapter was. And the last part, the boxed part, is what we want to pay attention to. So this is an example of a list of questions that I might bring in for a particular chapter. So the first question is really a very clear analysis question. It's, what does Smith mean by the Literacy Club? I don't say, what do you think of Smith's definition of Literacy Club? I don't say, what do you think of the idea of literacy clubs? We're really focused on the author and the text and what we think the author means. So I usually start with a question like that, because that leads us into other questions, like the second question. How do we get students to feel like members of what Smith means by literacy clubs? So this is a question asking my students who are teacher candidates to bring in their experience working with students and relate it to what Smith means by literacy clubs. And then the last questions are really very clearly perspectival questions. So what literacy clubs do you belong to? What literacy clubs do your students belong to? So now I'm asking for them to, in some ways, expand on the reading. So now that we've talked about what literacy clubs are, here is a question that involves you bringing in your own experience to connect with that idea. So to sum up, we've talked about 4 different kinds of questions. The first 2 are the kinds of questions you would bring into a seminar. You do the reading and kind of prepare questions in advance. And those are analysis questions and perspectival questions. The other 2 types of questions are a little bit more difficult to prepare because they're kind of dictated by what people say in the seminar. And those are clarification questions and expansion questions. All I can say about the latter 2 type of questions is that as you do more seminar and as you get used to the kinds of questions that provoke really good discussion, you'll get a lot better over time at figuring out what kinds of questions you may need to ask strategically just to push the discussion forward a little bit. So I hope those 4 categories help you in thinking about the kinds of questions you might want to bring into Socratic seminar.